Good morning, everyone. My name is Revathi Greenwood, and I am the Americas Head of Research at Cushman and Wakefield. And today we have a fantastic panel to talk about digital cities. And we're going to look at digital cities from all sides. So we've got Saul Salinas, who's a managing director at Accenture Digital, and also the global lead of smart cities. We also have Jennifer Bradley, who's a director at the Center of Urban Innovation at the Aspen Institute. We also have with us George Carianis, who's a vice president at CityNow Panasonic North America, and also on the City Advisory Board of San Jose. And finally, from the financing aspect, we have got Clara Brenner, who's a managing partner at the Urban Innovation Fund. Now, today we're going to look at digital cities, and when we were kind of chatting about it, it's such a vast topic that, the panelists and I decided that what might make sense in terms of a format is to kind of start with the basic questions and kind of define what we're actually talking about. And so we're going to first have Saul and Jennifer doing a 5 to 10 minute presentation on what makes a digital city and sort of look at it from the macro level. And then George giving us his experience with very, very specific case studies, and Clara then asking all the interesting questions on how on earth do you finance these things. We'll then have some pre-prepared Q&A and then open it up for panel for questions from the crowd. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Saul. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, and I think I have a mic. Thank you, and a special thank you for coming to the session, and for those of you who are outside or from outside of Washington, D.C., welcome to D.C. It's a gorgeous day, so hopefully you'll have an opportunity to go out and experience our beautiful city. Just a couple words on myself. I am of Hispanic heritage. So for those of you who are of Hispanic heritage and you're celebrating Spanish Heritage Month, felicidades, number one. Number two, for those of you who are advocates in either side of the scientific dialogue, by the way, of climate change, I believe this is Climate Day. And so, felicidades, and hopefully you're tracking that issue closely. My personal background, actually, I cut my teeth in my career in the commercial real estate industry, indirectly by way of my involvement in the Energy Star program, which I suspect many of you are involved or familiar with. I was the brand czar, if you will, for that program from 1991 to 2005. So interacted very closely with the commercial real estate industry on the commercial side, institutional side, and the residential side. And then I moved over to Accenture and, of course, oversee our smart cities work. So a couple sort of comments about the topic of smart cities. If you Google it or if you Bing it or whatever search engine you use, you're likely to get a lot of hits on smart cities. And I would argue 90% of what you get does not really sort of define, or I should say fall within the definition of what I regard or what my colleagues at Accenture regard as a smart city. Within the next 2 years, the research still indicates that there'll be something like 25 to 26 sensors per every human being on the planet. Sensors that measure your motion, measure temperature, measure humidity, measure various parts of basically anything that how humans conduct themselves. 26 per human being on the planet. A disproportionate number of those sensors will be in urban settings. All that information is going to flow somewhere. And it's going to flow to roughly 6 devices for every human being on the planet. So if you have a Fitbit, if you have an Apple Watch, if you have a medallion, if you've been to a Carnival cruise, you have a medallion, that information has to flow somewhere. 6 devices per every human being on the planet. The implications of that connectivity, we believe at Accenture, and certainly across the ecosystem that I interact with, are enormous. And so when we think about cities, and we think about smart cities, we see an opportunity sort of to fundamentally redefine the human experience. Redefine how we conduct ourselves on a daily, hourly basis. To have information available to us that's never been available to us in real time. To connect data streams that we care about that have never been connected before. What a smart city is not is a collection of pilots. Smart city isn't one that sort of takes the technology and says, I'm going to deploy it on this corridor, or it takes the technology and I'm going to deploy it on these fixtures and this sort of, street furniture. Yes, I think those are demonstrations of the kinds of technologies that one can deploy as part and parcel, if you will, of your commitment to bringing these new outcomes to life. But a collection of pilots does not a smart city make. In our opinion, a city that recognizes the fundamental opportunity to redefine the human experience, that recognizes that it is a long-term journey, that recognizes that technology is a means to an end, not an end in and of itself, that recognizes that there's opportunities to create new value for the city, for the various commercial players in the city over the long haul, and a city that recognizes that it takes a bit of an investment and is willing to sort of partner with the community to bring some of these new experiences forward. That's a city that's embraced the concept of smart cities. Now, the final thing that I would say is, are there any cities out there that have sort of met those criteria? A couple, a few, maybe. And we can talk about those in particular and what it is about them that makes them different. But it's early days. The technology is going to happen. These new experiences will take place, whether it's 3 years from now, 5 years from now, or 50 years from now. It's coming. And so I think all of us who work in the urban landscape, whether on the commercial side of things or on the public service side of things, whether those of us who are in a position to sort of bring this reality to life, it is coming. And so the question is, how do we participate in this new sort of exciting opportunity?
Thank you so much, Saul. Jen, over to you next. And when we talked, you mentioned that there were kind of 7 characteristics which made up a digital city. So very keen to kind of hear your take on this as well.
So I'm actually a bit of a digital city skeptic. I think that it is right now more of a marketing term or a way that cities seek to distinguish themselves from other cities. The conversation that Revathi is referring to is I mentioned that I had seen a definition of digital cities that came from the Center for Digital Governance, which is part of the media company that publishes GovTech magazine. So this is a ranking similar to, best places to live kind of ranking. It's useful. It's also a little bit kind of clickbait. Their characteristics of a digital city are open, citizen-centric, collaborative, secure, staffed and supported, connected, efficient, resilient, innovative, with use of best practices. To me, that simply sounds like a well-run city in an era of digital tools. And I think that we are moving towards a place, and I think Solomon's remarks foreshadowed this, where a digital city is just a city, and a smart city might possibly just be a city. So to your point that it's not about a collection of pilots, I think this is where cities are moving, that the digital infrastructure or the digital layer, as Sidewalk Labs likes to talk about in Toronto, is going to be as taken for granted as pipes and electrical wires and all of the other kinds of infrastructure in the city. The pressure that I would like to put on the notion of smart as opposed to digital similarly picks up on something that Sal mentioned, which is resident engaged and resident focused. From the city government perspective, you're starting to see a certain amount of skepticism, a certain amount of, you could call it kind of waking up from the tech sugar rush, where people are starting to say, okay, that's really interesting and cool and it's flashy, but what problem does it solve? And does it solve a problem for the company that's introducing the technology, which is their need to meet investor expectations or scale or come into new markets? Or does it solve a problem for city government and city residents? And very specifically, which city residents are they solving problems for? And so increasingly, if you look at the ISO, the International Standards Organization, they're working on a definition of smart cities that says and this is a preliminary sample definition. It's not the one they've landed on. But it says a smart city is one that dramatically increases the pace at which it improves its social, economic, and environmental sustainability outcomes, responding to challenges such as climate change, rapid population growth, and political and economic instability by fundamentally improving how it engages society, how it applies collaborative leadership, how it works across disciplines and systems, and how it uses data information and modern technologies to provide better services and quality of life to those involved and in the city now and for the foreseeable future without unfair disadvantage of others or degradation of the natural environment. That doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, I get that. But you'll note that in that giant word salad, right, data and technology appear only once. So people are starting to think of a smart city as a place that's equitable, that's healthful, that improves outcomes for all people. And so increasingly, again, as Solomon said, it's about tech as a means to an end. And I think what's interesting particularly about this conference, right, is we can really see the effects of technology in place and in community. Tech has this kind of everywhere, nowhereness about it, right? The way it empowers scale. But those sensors are in places, and those sensors are telling us about the experience of human bodies moving through a built environment. And so I think it's this tension, right, between the seemingly infinite possibilities of tech and the bounded experience of bodies and places that make smart cities particularly a kind of interesting concept. But the one thing that I would really want to leave you with is that for city governments, Boston's Beta Blocks program, right, which is one of their technology piloting arms, they make 3 powerful statements that they want everybody to know before they engage with them. And it's sensors are not smart, digital kiosks do not save the world, and efficiency is not democracy. I wish I'd written those things myself. But that's the skeptical hurdle that cities are putting in front of new companies. And so the question of to what end, and smart is not just tech, smart is about people and their experience of the city, is one that I think should be first and foremost in any conversation of the city, because it's about, again, the people and not the tech.
Thank you, Jennifer and Saul. I think that kind of makes me a little bit smarter as to kind of what we're talking about today. But, I think you put it brilliantly when you said that, it's not about the technology, it's about the people, and the technology is kind of an everywhere and nowhere discussion. But, at this point, I'm still confused. And so I'm going to hand it over to George to kind of get more granular and talk a little bit more in detail about, what exactly he's done and his experience has been with kind of implementing smart cities. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm George Karianis. I lead Panasonic City Now Connected and Resilient Business. We don't call it smart cities. We really dislike that term intensely. It's vendor-driven. It means everything, so it kind of means nothing. And we've kind of heard that earlier. And so I'll just, my background is in emerging technologies and complex systems, which really is the essence of city systems. So I'll just walk you through a couple of use cases and lessons learned. So why is a TV manufacturer talking to you about smart communities, right? So in Japan, over the last 15 years, Panasonic has uniquely built a very human-centric community that is most likely one of the most sustainable and by far the most resilient community in the world. 45-acre manufacturing complex outside of Tokyo in a community called Fujisawa. We bladed it. We partnered with over a dozen partners in Japan, and this will be 1,000 families living there at full build-out. Over 700 families live there today. I'm a technology geek, right? So I went there and I expected this technology religious experience. And my first aha was that the technology is everywhere, but it's nowhere. It is not about technology. It is about lifestyle. And that's what blew me away. And so that is key. In terms of resiliency, the community is a 7-day microgrid. Every home has 3 days food and water. The community center in the upper right doesn't have mechanicals on the roof. Hundreds of residents can gather on the roof, and the roof is above the tsunami flood line. The rather prosaic park bench at the bottom converts to a barbecue grill, right? So sustainability and resiliency is just woven deeply into the fabric of this community. The sustainability KPIs on the right are very impressive in terms of carbon, water, and energy. The one I care the most about, these homes are worth 25% more than the same size home across the street. So sustainability and resiliency can drive superior ROI, which means it doesn't need subsidy, right? This can scale. And Japan is slightly different, right? It's not, every region is going to be different. 4 years ago, we stood up our smart city business in Denver, Colorado. We looked at 25 cities. We chose Denver because of this collection of stakeholders who were collectively very interested in a more innovative region. And we don't have time to get into this. I want to invite you all to come visit us at Peña Station next in Denver. We'll show you firsthand what we're doing. But what really strikes me is smart cities, not only do we dislike the term, we define smart cities as whatever that collection of regional stakeholders define as important. It can be tech-rich, it can be tech-poor, it should never, ever be tech-led. And so when we first came together 4 years ago, this collection of stakeholders, and this slide is not a Panasonic statement, this is a stakeholder statement. We were going to do community Wi-Fi, we were going to do smart street lights, we were going to do a microgrid, right? This was as far as the collective could see. And what really amazes me is that when you bring these stakeholders together, when you keep them focused quarter over quarter, year over year, election cycle over election cycle, what you can accomplish will just blow everyone away, right? So what we knew we were going to innovate on was pretty cool. What we ultimately have innovated on in under 4 years is absolutely amazing. And so that is the key message in Denver. We're also working in Toronto with the Toronto Transit Commission on fleet electrification. Fleet electrification is going to happen tremendously quick, relatively speaking, very fast. And it has profound implications for cities, for transit agencies, for utilities, and for developers as well. So this is an initial pilot of 60 buses over 3 parking garages. And this is going to, again, fleet electrification is going to change when you can charge these buses over 2 minutes as you're loading and unloading, right? Really changes how you think about electrification. There's a whole session on that, not getting into it. What I will say is that this space is so enormously complex. You cannot get your mind wrapped around it because it's smart city, it's IoT. This label belongs to everything. And what we realized very quickly in Denver, even in our very well-informed, hard-working team, we were talking past each other. Is that a smart street light? You mean the luminaire? Do you mean the wireless controller? Do you mean an IoT application on the pole? Do you mean the right-of-way? What are you really talking about? So we built this 20,000 square foot innovation showcase. You can think of it as a studio backlot. And in here, it's a micro city. We can demonstrate any smart home, smart building, smart grid, or smart city application. That's pretty cool. But where it's really impactful, we bring our stakeholders here and we take them through kindergarten and elementary school and high school. We make them use the same words to mean the same thing so that when they go off to plan and prioritize and invest, they're not talking past each other. So this has proven to be incredibly useful. And developers and city planners, urban planners here. So I'll close by saying, what should you be doing differently? Everything on this slide. Not one thing, all of it. Okay? Integrated multi-stakeholder planning. The developer, the city, and the utility typically have an arm's length relationship. And you really need to go from a series of transactional handshakes to a collective strategic group hug that lasts for years. Communications. You can never be too rich, too thin, or have too much fiber. You just cannot. 5G, you are not ready for it. The public right-of-way is so poorly managed in almost every urban setting, it's sad. Social equity has risen to the top in every city. It's not the city's responsibility, it is everyone's responsibility to close that. Workforce housing requires public-private partnerships, right? It really does. It can be solved. We must solve it. It will mean small space living. We're a Japanese company. Small space living can be really good. It doesn't have to stink. You're not living in closets. Community resiliency, that's Hurricane Michael that hit Mexico Beach. It's a devastating photo, but I think it's a very good analogy for community resiliency. Do you want your community to be the one that was prepared or the one that wasn't, right? In terms of mobility, shifting under your feet in real time. You see that with micromobility, with everything, EVs, eventually autonomy. And then business models, innovate in your business models. You really need to do this. And then carbon reduction, you need to get to net zero. Hundreds of communities are making net zero pledges. You're building facilities that last 40 years, get net carbon.
Thank you so much, George. That was utterly fascinating. And I think, you've really kind of taken us through kind of the kindergarten, elementary school, kind of high school level of what it actually means to kind of get these things off the ground. But you made an important point, which is, in the first case study you talked about in Japan, you said there was a 25% ROI increase when you compare to the development across the street. So Clara, when we start talking about money, very keen to get your thoughts on, how do you look at these smart cities or digital cities or clever cities? Let's call them clever cities. How do you get the money into these?
Sure. Hi, everybody. As you may have deduced by the fact that I think I'm the only person in this room wearing jeans, I hail from faraway land of Silicon Valley, and I think I'm supposed to be here talking about how startups have a role in all of this. And certainly I think most of the innovation that's been mentioned so far is being driven by government or frankly consulting firms and big conglomerates. But so much of the innovation that's being adopted most quickly is coming from the ground up, from entrepreneurs. And sometimes they're selling to government, sometimes they're selling to folks like you, and oftentimes they're selling direct to consumer. So I thought I would just give you like a little bit of a background on our firm and the kinds of companies we invest in, just to give you some context. So I run a fund called the Urban Innovation Fund. We're based in San Francisco. We invest in startups shaping the future of cities, which kind of runs the gamut in terms of industry vertical, from areas that you might think of as more traditional smart city sectors, so IoT and sensors and transportation, but also the future of work and fintech and education. All of these sectors are important in terms of creating an equitable and delightful place to live. So we do really early stage investing, like pre-seed and seed stage, that first institutional check in the door. And then we also offer these companies regulatory and political support, since that's something that most startups are very bad at. And is very important in terms of getting their product into the hands of actual people. So a couple examples. We were really early investors in a company called Apana. They're a hardware and software solution for large commercial and industrial real estate holders who have big water bills. It's kind of a mouthful. So they work with companies like Costco. They're installed in every Costco in North America. They've helped them reduce their water use by 22%. What's another good example? Talking about small space living, we were early investors in a company called Bumblebee Spaces, which is a robotic furniture company. They want to be like the Murphy bed of the 21st century. So actually everything is stored in the ceiling, and you can recall your bed, your desk, your closet with the touch of a button. They've actually had a lot of early traction in places like the Bay Area and Seattle, where of course space has been a premium, and the idea is, how do you make a one-bedroom function like a two-bedroom, or a studio function like a one-bedroom? They're a really interesting company. Another example is a company called Catch. They're a mobile benefits platform for the future of work. They've had a lot of traction, in particular with 1099 gig economy workers. So say you're a drywaller and a Lyft driver. It'll help you estimate and pay your quarterly taxes so you don't get penalized, but it'll also help you shop for and manage all in one place products like health insurance, life insurance, paid leave. So if your kid is sick and you can't work for that week, you don't get paid for that week. That's potentially devastating. So it helps you plan for and save for those types of life events in a tax advantage way. We just think these companies are really interesting and are really augmenting people's experience of the built environment. Certainly there's no replacement for brick and mortar transformation. That is critical to any city, but we think technology can make the experience of regular people much more delightful and ultimately better for everybody.
Thank you so much, Clara. I think, we've kind of looked at it for digital cities from kind of all sides now, but can we kind of just go back to the basic question, what actually makes a digital city different, and what are kind of really the benefits? And Saul, can we get your take on that?
Sure. And I touched on this in my initial comments, and I think all of us have touched on this. For us, the ultimate KPI of a digital city, and I'm going to actually use a slightly different term because it's a term that I increasingly use, is a sentient city. Is the ultimate KPI is the human experience different? And I've met with hundreds of our counterparts in cities and states and countries, and as well as our partners in this endeavor. And there's a lot of discussion about bytes and bits and routers and gateways and solution stacks, and we all know the language. And there's deployment to these individual technologies here and there, et cetera, et cetera. But the question that I sort of tend to ask our friends and colleagues is, did it make a difference? Did someone feel something different? Did someone see something differently? Did someone in this commercial smart district, which you just described, see something, sense something, touch something, feel something, think differently as a result of this massive deployment of technologies? If the answer is no, then why are we investing in it? So I tend to romanticize this topic. I'm a big Star Trek fan, but you go into the holodeck and you see things differently. And so if these technologies are in fact as magical as they are, and we believe they are, by the way, because we interact with our partners on this on a regular basis, then let's challenge ourselves to change the human experience. Again, we can talk about solution stacks, all day. As the example I used is what John F. Kennedy stood up, beginning of the '60s, and said, let's put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. He said, let's not build a Saturn V. So the question we keep asking ourselves, what is your moonshot? If you're Dubai, what do you want to be known for? What's the human experience in Dubai that you want to bake in? And if you're Atlanta, what's yours? And if you're Washington, D.C., what's yours? And so for us, again, sort of to just at the risk of over-romanticizing the topic, is that's where we start. And when we have the conversation with our partners and anyone in a position in public sector, or otherwise, by the way, in the commercial sector, to change the human experience, that's what we sort of start with. And we resist the temptation to have a conversation about layer one of the solution stack, the analytics at, the management of the data at level 2, the analytics at level 3, the window panes at level 3. We resist the temptation to have that conversation initially. We just have a conversation about what, I think all of us touched on this. What are the problems you haven't solved yet?
Maybe I can jump in and provide a different perspective. I think the challenge with all of this moonshot language is it's a lot of thinking about doing stuff, and tactical interventions ultimately, I think, are where technology has an appropriate role to play, and where all of us can really do something. So I'll just give you an example. So we were early investors in a company called Votes. They're a mobile voting platform. So when you think about what's wrong with voting, whether it's showing up to community meetings for rezoning of a particular parcel, or the presidential election, the challenge is that people don't do it. But there's also some very legitimate concerns about security. Is Russia tampering with our elections? And so the idea with Votes is that if you can empower people to vote on their phone, many more people will do it. And if you can record those votes on the blockchain, you can actually monitor and audit those elections. So this company actually just completed the first federal election that was mobile enabled last year. And the idea is this has the potential to change, of course, the way we elect public officials, but also the way we conduct our business as citizens and real estate developers and planners, as well as, of course, doing things like shareholder voting. And for me, that's what's exciting about this innovation. It's not like, oh, moonshot, just think about the hologram that you could walk through on your way to school. It's, what can you do and change now through your work as either private citizens or within government?
And I would add, I view it as and, not or. The technology is incessant, right? The pace of technological innovation is not going to stop. It's going to continue to accelerate, which is really going to create a lot of discontinuity in society. But you can't stop that. And at the same time, if you don't have strategic planning, then you end up with technology that, as an example, in San Diego, they spent $30 million deploying 4,200 smart street light nodes, video sensors, environmental sensors, but they didn't do a good enough job of communicating. So just this week, citizens group sued to block usage of that $30 million investment out of fears of privacy, right? And that's not a privacy problem, that's a communication problem. The technology's there, you're not stopping it. You got to get in front of it from a policy perspective. So it's both.
And I think that there is this, I think technology envisions a seamlessness that does not map onto the experience of humans not just consuming their environments, but also creating their environments. So how much do residents want to have their minds changed in any particular urban environment, right? We can all imagine, right, that there are some political contexts in which saying the city government and a big tech company are going to control your mind, right? They're going to deliver something for you and it's going to change how you feel and how you think. And that can sound really exciting or it can sound completely terrifying. And so I think there is actually quite useful and productive pushback. And it starts at the tactical level, right? How comfortable are people with using a platform like Votes? And there will be times when residents say, no, we do not want this optimized experience that you're offering us. So I get a little, yes, the advance of technology is inevitable. I've done some work on cities and autonomous vehicles, and people say, well, there's going to be a lot of job losses with autonomous vehicles. Do you think that cities will accept it? And I can't think of an example where, certainly in the United States, we have said we will not accept this technological advance because we care about jobs. We usually will say, take the technological advance and we'll figure out jobs on the other end. But because technology often creates new jobs, right, in the midst of destroying them. But there is a deep sense that people, first of all, we don't know right now what level of privacy we have. And that's actually how I got onto this panel and in this conversation in the first place, is I was thinking, well, commercial real estate, you guys are sort of, the original sensors because of all of the security cameras, right, that are in the commercial real estate settings. Nobody was really freaked out about that. So if we just had a baseline understanding of how much privacy we've already, or how much knowledge about our movements, let's use a more neutral term, how much knowledge about our movements that we already seed when we walk through urban space, I think that would be quite useful in resetting it, because privacy is too deep a term. What do we mean? Right? Google reads my email. I mean, so what is it? What does privacy now mean, and what is a kind of new construction of privacy that we want to achieve democratically? And is it okay if that varies a little from place to place? Is it okay if the experiences that the digital and technological world are offering us are different in Washington, D.C.? Will you have to sign some kind of disclosure or consent form, right, as the train pulls into Philadelphia to say, hey, this is our privacy framework? And we don't know yet how we're going to negotiate all of this, but the backlash, the frustration, the fear, the people saying, stop, I don't want this, is real. And so I think that the speed of trust and the speed of human decision-making is very different from the speed of technology, and we're going to have to find a better balance and a little more respect, right, for bulky humans who don't get it and didn't read the memo, and think about how to bring them along in a way, or listen to them when they say, no, I really don't want that optimization that you're giving me, right? And I think that that's coming into the definition of smart. Smart is going to start to mean also collaborative, well-informed, and letting people make decisions that some people think are totally not optimized or not the best decisions, because that's kind of what democracy invites us to do.
A couple comments, if I could. I think Jennifer touched on a couple things that are really sort of important to point out. Obviously, the issue of data privacy and security, those issues come up as they should on a regular basis as more information is available, as more sensors, as we get surrounded by this technology. The ways that I'm sort of the eternal optimist when it comes to this, you know, and by no means am I a historian, but at least my personal sense has been that anytime sort of a new technology comes forward, we decide as human beings to adopt it based on risk and reward. So when we moved from horse-drawn carriage to a vehicle, we entered into a social contract with the manufacturers of, you know, these horseless vehicles that basically sort of said, I will ride in one and I'll trust you that it is safe, right or wrong. But we entered into sort of a social contract to do that. And now we all don't think twice when we get into our vehicles. Or perhaps we do, but you know, we have sort of an assurance that we're relatively safe. Same thing with airplanes. When the airplanes became sort of mainstream, we entered into a social contract that said, this is a new technology, but I trust, quote unquote, with the manufacturers, Boeing, et cetera, that I will be safe and I'll get from point A to point B. When I enter into a contract with American Express or MasterCard to transact something online, I trust that the benefits of effecting that transaction outweigh the costs of the data breach and security, right or wrong. When I say, when we talk about sort of these innovations, I believe we all are going to be in a position to enter into that contract. I also think there's a generational difference in our willingness to enter into that contract or not. I've got 6 kids, ages 28 to 2.5. I can tell you that my older children, 28, 26, 24, embrace these technologies, and I won't speak for them, but I suspect they're more likely to enter into the contract to have real data available to them in real time than perhaps I am, and perhaps my parents are willing to enter into. So I think there's a generational difference. And we'll see. I mean, we'll see how it sort of shakes out. I think the good news is that there are a lot of very smart people, including folks in my company, suspect Panasonic and the organizations that are represented here, that are working on this issue of data privacy and security. Because that's an important one. The other thing I was going to say very quickly, if I could, is that to me, all these data streams, there's already sort of a demonstrated failure in how this happens if it happens independently or sort of not connected, and that's this. Because if all this data is going to enable me to interact with the environment in a seamless way, and not just interact, by the way, with this room or this building or this city, but globally, have a view, if you will, situational awareness, sort of wayfinding on steroids, if you will, which I believe is one of the benefits of this connectivity. The last thing we would want is to duplicate what we're doing on the phone. Half of us walk down the street looking at our phone, navigating 80, 100 different applications that came to me separately and disconnected. Now imagine when we move into a 5G environment and you're having to navigate data streams, the last thing we would want is to do the same thing. I think to those of us who are sort of believe in the magic of these technologies, at the end of the day, need to figure out a way to deliver that information seamlessly, simply, in a way that doesn't distract me from the fact that I'm crossing the street. I don't know what that looks like. We have an idea of what that looks like, Accenture, but that to me, what we don't want is for all that information for the 100 apps that I have on my phone to become 1,000 apps, because that's sort of going in the opposite direction.
And in terms of data privacy, I agree with what Saul said, and I think a good maxim is trust, but verify.
Absolutely. As you're all talking, I've got so many more questions that kind of it all raises from what I have on my list, but I'm conscious of time and I want to give the audience a chance to ask questions as well. So I guess in terms of looking at it from a commercial real estate perspective, how should this affect how we think about commercial real estate? And more importantly, for a lot of our audience at the ULI today, how do kind of real estate participants kind of get into driving this process of transformation? And can we start with you, George, on that?
Certainly, and it kind of goes to the last slide that I shared, right? Developers need to bring the utilities, the city leadership, the transit agencies, not just to the same table. You've got to get to the same side of the table which is really hard, because then you're sharing balance sheets. So you get that stakeholder alignment, and then that drives, that unlocks the public-private financing potential, which then leads to impactful decisions. So from a real estate developer perspective, things like community resiliency, developers and tenants love the benefits of solar and batteries and microgrids, but they don't want to pay for it. And yet investor-owned utilities must deploy capital to generate a return. And so that can't be an afterthought. If the utility is at the planning table together, you can design in distributed resources such as solar and batteries, reduce the building's peak demand, provide some level of resiliency. In terms of vehicle electrification, from your multifamily perspective, if you're not running conduit to 100% of your parking spaces, start tomorrow, right? Just do it, because that's going to shift very quickly. In terms of decarbonization, many cities are passing net zero goals and mandates by 2050, usually, or earlier. San Luis Obispo, 2035. Not municipal buildings, the entire community, net zero. And yet developers are building 40-year assets. So begin to build, start small but move quickly, begin to build carbon neutral communities, right? Start small. So you have to be driving it. Your business as usual is your enemy, okay? This industry in general talks a much better game than it plays when it comes to innovation in the built environment. And if that sounds like heresy, I apologize.
Thank you. Clara, what would your take on this be in terms of commercial real estate implications?
There are positive implications and then there are negative implications. From the positive perspective, I would say people in the real estate industry have a unique perspective that I think most professionals don't have, which is that you straddle both the sort of private and the public realms. You're engaging with government officials and regulators as well as, competitors and, tenants, and those are really helpful insights for entrepreneurs who, historically have not really had to think about regulation, but whether you're Lyft and Uber and you're like breaking every law in the world, or you're just trying to get some new sensor installed in a building, this is a new way of thinking for entrepreneurs, and they could really benefit from both advisors and early investors who come from the real estate industry. Obviously, being an early adopter is another option. So a lot of our companies end up engaging at a very early stage with folks in the real estate industry. So definitely the companies I mentioned earlier, but also companies like, there's a company called Eden, which is essentially trying to be an airport lounge for cities. So they just became an early tenant in Hudson Yards in New York. And that was a real value add for the facility. They wanted to be able to attract folks to come in off of the street on a regular basis who weren't just tourists, but folks who were going to be coming in and using it as professionals on a daily basis. So there's definitely, I think, a lot of opportunity on the positive side. I would say on the negative side, you're going to have to start competing for talent in a way you probably weren't anticipating previously. So my background's in commercial real estate development. I grew up here in DC. I worked for Monument Realty. And then I ended up getting a job at a friend's company. He was starting a new company, what I thought was in the real estate space, but ultimately became Fundrise, which some of you might be familiar with. It's essentially kind of like a betterment type product, but for private real estate assets. So both accredited and non-accredited investors can get access to investment opportunities in the real estate space. They're an awesome company. I had an amazing time working there, and it set me off on a totally different path. And so many of my favorite people who work at companies like WeWork, Lyft, Airbnb, Fundrise, they came from the real estate industry. They're urban planners, they're real estate developers or recovering real estate developers. Because they have a lot of savvy around these issues, they have a really unique set of talents and also passion. They want to, get their hands dirty. They want to be solving really interesting problems in their communities. I think that's why so many people get involved in the real estate space. And so many people who, historically, like if you wanted to solve urban problems, you'd go work for government, or if you were cool and you wanted to make money, you'd go work in real estate. And now people have more options. And I think that that's something to be aware of. So many of the folks who apply for jobs at firms like ours come from the real estate space. They come from urban planning programs. And so I think it's really important for folks who are continuing to work in the real estate space and want to compete. Like, you have to think about ways to continue to engage and attract, especially younger employees, because they have a lot more options now. Like, they could go work for you, or they could go work for somebody who just raised $50 million from Andreessen Horowitz. Like, what's cooler? hopefully it's you. But it's just something to keep in mind.
Thank you. I think you touched a chord with a lot of us when you used the word recovering real estate developer. Now, Jennifer and Saul, what would your take on this be in terms of commercial real estate implications?
So I know the least about commercial real estate, so that gives me just freedom to say pretty much anything because I'm not bounded by fact or data. One thing that I think might be interesting is if the commercial real estate industry created a standard for explaining or storytelling about what it means to move through this space, how much data you're collecting, and why you're collecting it, and how you're using it, to tell us how you are using our data, some of the sensors that you're using, to create a better environment so you can help demystify the technology that we're moving through. Speaking of Hudson Yards, I had a meeting at Sidewalk Labs, and in the Google part of the building, the elevators are completely unintelligible. They're smart elevators. They sort of route them like taxis. You can't just press a button. There's no storytelling. Somebody took pity on me. She was like, oh yeah, you're over 45. You're gonna need an explanation. So like explain the world that you are building to us so that we maybe don't feel so lost in it. And then just my personal plea, and this is not so much about smart cities, but like make places that make us want to put down our phones. Make places that are infused by technology, but that we don't have to mediate through technology. Make places that are really, really good for us to be humans together. That's what I think you can do.
So Jennifer, you made a point a few minutes ago about sort of having healthy skepticism. And I think that's a good sort of approach to take. And it is in fact the case that the public sector, cities in particular, for good reasons, are taking very small steps in adopting these technologies for financial reasons, governance reasons, political reasons, et cetera. So where do we see the action? We see it in commercial districts, whether it's, again, there are successes and failures. In every project that I could mention, there's some growing pains. Sidewalk Labs, Hudson Yards, Tampa Water Street, Bangkok, Fujisawa, et cetera. So I regard the commercial real estate industry as being sort of the true innovators in this space. And I would encourage you and challenge you to sort of think about your specific roles in bringing some of the magic of these technologies. So like within a bounded geography, targeted towards a bounded demographic, across a bounded timeline, with specific bounded ROIs. That's the beauty of working in the commercial sector, commercial real estate on the commercial side. And we're beginning to see successes. And so what happens is when you have a success and you have the next generation come in and say, yep, I want that level of connectivity in the condominium. Not only do I want the square footage, not only do I want the bayside window, not only do I want, whatever it is, but I want the connectivity that you're delivering me. And I think increasingly that is going to be the case. So you get that, but if you succeed, then the surrounding metropolis, if you will, we believe, will take heed and use it as an example. And that's happening. Again, it's still early days. But our hope is that that's where that innovation will blossom. And I think Clara said something earlier, which is, the financing is huge. Because I think we have put an undue burden, an undue expectation on the part of our cities, which are stretched, by the way, to fund innovation. And so why not seek other sources of funding? And we're doing that as Accenture. George mentioned consortia. We've sort of assembled what we regard as a smart city dream team of best-in-class global providers of technology, of analytics, of financing to bring to the table and say, look, we believe in us, we believe in the vision, and we believe that you need help in sort of financing this, so here it is. So again, I think that the challenge, I think, for the commercial real estate industry is identify those bounded projects and have them be demonstrations of success. And they are popping up all over the globe.
Thank you, Saul. I think you had a lot of us when you said that the commercial real estate industry is at the forefront of innovation when it comes to this, because we are not used to being at the forefront of innovation. We're always kind of lagging behind. But this was such a great discussion. When I kind of first started looking at this, when somebody said digital cities, I'm a science fiction fan, so I was thinking of a cross between Blade Runner and Minority Report. But it's reality here with kind of Hudson Yards and Fujisawa, and kind of makes it all much more real and integrated into our lives. But now what I'd like to do is I'd like to open it up to the audience to ask our very smart panel all the questions you want to ask on this. And I think there are mics, for you to use. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Hi, how are you? My name is Alberto Gadali. I'm a master's student in real estate development and urbanism at University of Miami. I'm very curious for, let's say, startups or private companies. Say they have an idea and their major client is the city. Could you give some insight in how is that process on selling something to a city, how difficult it is, how you go through it, and also what are the cities that are most helpful in that space?
Oof, it sucks, which is why Accenture does it and most startups don't. Frankly, it takes a lot of time and a tremendous number of resources to be able to get through that process. Certainly we invest in some companies who sell to government, but oftentimes we try to back companies who have multiple potential sales channels. So in the case of votes, for example, they started by doing voting on college campuses, and then they did township voting in places like New England where they have participatory budgeting, where it was like a pretty no-brainer, low barrier to entry, and it was only over time where they gained the kind of credibility to sell to a customer like a state government or the federal government. That's certainly not a reason to not do it, but oftentimes we get excited about companies that could sell both to private industry as well as municipal government, just because it's a really painful process. And anytime we hear a company, like a lot of times you'll hear companies that say, oh, we figured it out, like we figured out how to sell to government, we're gonna get under their procurement threshold, of whatever it is, $25,000. And for us as venture investors, we're looking for a 10x return in 5 to 7 years. 25K from every city in this country is not enough to get us there. And so it's a really tough needle to thread, but it doesn't mean it's not worth doing, but it takes a very unique company, I think, to be able to figure it out.
Cities are better influencers than check writers.
Thank you.
Walter Horsting with Sensory Interactive. My background has been in smart city control rooms to integrating technology for Department of Homeland Security. A cautionary note that I just might like to get your comments on is in China, there's social scaling of the population to control movement throughout the country. I'm concerned about big tech having too much control on your information to censor your beliefs and controlling your access. Thank you.
Everybody's looking at me to answer that. I think that is going to be an increasingly common concern, right? As AI, for example, starts to play, or algorithmic decision making in really important areas like criminal justice. And so that's what I was talking about. When there are going to be hard brakes on efficiency, and tech is going to have to justify itself and justify its value and perhaps be told no. I don't think that we need to accept a narrative of certain kinds of inevitability. If you look at San Francisco has banned facial recognition technology, right, in law enforcement because of these fears about the technology being used poorly. So I think it is incumbent on the tech industry maybe not to say, trust us, or even not to say trust but verify. How in the world am I going to verify the black box of a machine learning algorithm? It's learning without me. So I think we will have to create new forms of regulation and consultation and check-in to make sure that we don't back into a dystopia, and it will be exceptionally messy and contentious and uneven. That's what makes the United States quite different from an environment like China. I would hypothesize that many of the people in the room would accept that trade-off for greater messiness, because that's also what's known, we could also call that by names of like self-determination, and making sure that people are comfortable with the frictions that are inevitably going to emerge as we all learn together to live in a more tech-enabled environment. And what are the kind of, again, bulky human qualities that we want to continue to hang on to, and those will always play out in physical public space as well as digital space. And so you're also kind of the stewards and guardians, right, of a lot of the public spaces where we find ourselves.
Hi, my name is Dan McCauley. I'm an architect and a land planner with the Martin Architectural Group. And first I wanted to say thank you to the panel. As you were talking and we were listening, I can't help but have a cold chill go up my spine as we're talking about the amount of data. And as you're discussing amongst yourselves, when I'm buying a car or I'm doing something, there is a social contract. I have no idea how to verify who's taking my data, who's selling it, that I'm not going to get, in 5 years, a letter from my insurance company that says, my phone knows I didn't walk 10,000 steps today, so your rate just went up. So I'm a skeptic, and I'm a Gen X, so I'm extra skeptic because I didn't grow up with all this technology. On the other side, I'm an architect, and I work with developers, and our intent is to try and help them push the technology and understand more. And to this gentleman's examples, we are working on passive house designs and trying to reduce the amount of energy that everybody uses in that aspect. So I wanted to ask the panel, for technology you don't yet develop, for things we don't yet know, how would you recommend the developers and the planners kind of future-proof, to the best that we can, our 40-year projects that we're putting into place right now?
Well, I would say it starts with communications infrastructure. You don't want to overinvest inside the facility. You want to make sure that there's tremendous connectivity and resiliency to a facility, and then you want the market to innovate at its rapid pace. And more than anything, I would say this industry needs to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. It has an over tendency of looking in the rearview mirror, and it needs to start trusting LiDAR.
Yeah, I would say, there's a lot to your question, but to the extent that you're in a position to put forward sort of a unifying database, if you will, behind a project, a commercial project, make sure that it's open source, modular, scalable, so that it can handle whatever data ingest you would want to handle 5 years out, 10 years out, you said 40 years out. And those exist, by the way. Again, sort of make sure that the connectivity is there that handles sort of the bandwidth that you need 5, 10, 15 years out, George said. And continue to sort of pulse those who are going to traverse the space. I mean, whether somebody lives, works, or plays there, as to sort of what is it that they need by way of information, frankly. I mean, I think it sounds super simplistic, but to me, those would be the top 3 things to do to sort of future-proof it. If you did the opposite, then you will, I think, increasingly see tenants or owners in the space demand, expect information that you may not be able to sort of provide if you haven't dropped fiber in, or if you haven't put 5G in, or LTE in, or LoDAR, et cetera, or that you can't ingest through a unified platform. I mean, that's the alternative. So again, I'm a believer that the technology is coming. And so as a developer, you can't just, it's just no longer brick and mortar. It has to be sentient brick and mortar.
Thank you so much, Saul. I think we have got time for one last question, so.
Yeah, I'm David Broderson. I'm a real estate developer and building owner manager. I wanted to talk a little bit about the broad range of opinion on this global issue, using Europe as an example. The recent data protection regulation that went in place in Europe, is a sort of a stop, let's say, in this world. And my experience working in Europe, that it typically starts with smart government before you get to smart cities. And in the real estate environment, I think it has to start with smart managers before you get to smart buildings. And I would just ask if you have any opinion about, building the trust from the government first before you take on the whole city.
Well, I would say that trust is going to be engendered through both education of the individual and transparency of the organization. That's the hardest part. I think that addresses the rub that Clara was talking about, that inevitable friction. If there's transparency and there's informed consent, that is a fair deal.
Yeah.
Or even co-creation, right? A lot of the trend now in smarter, small s, smarter government is no longer just broadcasting to residents, here's what we're going to do, and you residents get to say whether we paint the door of the community center blue or gray. Fabulous, citizen engagement. That increasingly people will be working with government through things like participatory budgeting to create the kinds of standards. I love the construct of its smart government, but also in the built environment, smart managers rather than smart buildings, because that does center the human actor, the human decision maker, the human who's telling technology what to do and what not to do. And I think it's important to continue to center that. So yeah, I agree with the notion, but I don't think that communication will be as successful if it's broadcast and explain. There has to be a channel for communication to come back and for that input to make a difference. Otherwise, people tune out, right? This was part of the vote. This is often part of the voting or town meeting problem, is people won't show up for things that are not really going to, they won't invest their time in something that's not really going to make a difference.
A quick comment, if I could, on the data privacy and security issue. I'll go back to sort of my prop, but I had a conversation with about 50 different CIOs, city CIOs in Toronto about 6 months ago, and we had a hard stop on the conversation that we had because of the security issue. My personal opinion is that we shouldn't do a hard stop on connectivity and the magic of these technologies because of our concern about compromising our privacy and security. That should not be the answer. We should focus on it as an important issue. For the time being, I can opt out of Waze if I want to. So for the time being, as long as we give consumers the ability to opt out of the connectivity, I think that begins to solve some of the problem. So I cannot use Waze if I don't want. Frankly, I don't have to transact on American Express online if I don't want to. But at the same time, I have to sign an acceptance, sort of an agreement. I don't know that any of us read all of it, maybe we should, that is this social contract I talked about earlier. So as long as we give these, again, sort of our consumers the ability to opt out, I think that's the beginning of a solution. At some point,
opt out of public space.
at some point, I was going to say, at some point, we have to figure out how I can carve myself out of the public realm. I don't know what that looks like. But if, for example, there are cameras at Farragut Square in DC, 2 blocks down, I need to be able to carve myself out of that somehow, because I may not want to be taped. Again, I don't know what that looks like.
I think it looks a little bit like
Singapore.
Singapore.
Sorry?
Might look a little bit like Singapore right now.
It could be, exactly. I mean, so as long as we continue to, at the very least, enable people to carve themselves out of the experience. There are a lot of people who don't fly because they're afraid to fly for legitimate personal reasons. And a lot of people who probably still don't get in a vehicle over 70 miles an hour for legitimate personal reasons. A lot of people who may not want to go across Farragut Square if I'm being looked at by 10 different cameras, as long as we let them carve themselves out. To me, that's at least one way in the interim to address the issue.
Thank you so much. I think we have run out of time, and I want to be respectful of all your time. I just want to say a huge thank you to our wonderful panel for an amazing discussion on cities.